Hey there, and welcome. Today we're diving into a really big theological question, one that gets debated all the time. Can you actually find the Trinity in the Old Testament?
So let's get right into the heart of the matter. The word Trinity, well, it's not in the Bible. Not once. Not in the Old Testament, not in the New. And yet, it's this huge central belief for Christians, something the New Testament clearly teaches. So, where did it even come from?
You know, the Old Testament doesn't just give you a neat little dictionary definition, but what a lot of people believe is that it lays all the groundwork. It's filled with clues and hints that only really snap into focus later on. So for our time together, we're going to be detectives, okay? We're on the hunt for those foundational clues.
So, our investigation really kicks off with what looks like a major puzzle, this kind of tension between the Old and New Testaments.
Here's the challenge, right? The absolute bedrock of the Old Testament is the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's all about God's oneness. But then you get to the New Testament and it reveals God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So how on earth do you put those two things together? Well, our very first clues might actually be hiding in the original language.
All right. Our first stop is the original Hebrew. Believe it or not, the very words used to talk about God might just hold the key.
Okay, this is so important. The Hebrew word for one, in that famous phrase, the Lord is one, is echad. Now, this word doesn't just mean a single, solitary one. Nope. It often means a composite unity, a one made up of parts. The classic example is in Genesis, where a husband and a wife, two distinct people, come together and become one, echad, flesh. So, could God also be a kind of composite unity?
And if you look even closer at that same verse, Deuteronomy 6:4, you see something else that's just fascinating. It uses God's personal, singular name, Yahweh, right next to the word Elohim. And in Hebrew, that im at the end, that's a plural ending. So the most famous statement about God's oneness uses a singular name right next to a plural one. That's a pretty interesting linguistic clue, right?
And it doesn't stop there. It keeps happening. Multiple times we see God talking about himself using plural pronouns. Like at creation, let us make mankind in our image. Or at the Tower of Babel, come, let us go down. And check out Isaiah. It's wild. God asks a singular question, whom shall I send? And then immediately follows it with a plural one, and who will go for us? So you gotta wonder, who is the us he's talking to?
Okay, our next clue isn't about grammar. It's about a mysterious character who shows up again and again throughout the Old Testament.
This figure, the angel of the Lord, is just different from any other angel. He doesn't just show up to deliver a message from God. Sometimes he speaks as God using I and me. And that just blurs the lines in a really significant way.
I mean, listen to this moment. It's just astonishing. Abraham is about to sacrifice his son, Isaac, to God. But the one who stops him is the angel of the Lord. And he says, "You have not withheld from me your son." He takes the worship for himself, as if it was meant for him all along. He's speaking with God's authority.
This just raises a massive question, doesn't it? Regular angels always point away from themselves, towards God. But this angel, he seems to be God in some way, but at the same time, he's distinct from God the Father. For many theologians, this is a major clue, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, a glimpse of the second person of the Godhead right there in the Old Testament.
So our third set of clues really builds on that idea. Now we're going to look for passages that seem to hint at distinctions, maybe even conversations happening within the Godhead.
Yeah, beyond just the plural language, there are these moments that almost feel like we're eavesdropping on a conversation between divine persons, hinting at a deep complexity within the one God.
Just look at these. In Psalm 110, David writes, "The Lord said to my Lord." You have Yahweh speaking to Adonai. That's one divine person speaking to another. Or in Psalm 45, the writer is talking to God and then says, "Therefore God, your God, has anointed you," making a distinction between two figures who are both called God. And Nehemiah draws a clear line between God and your Spirit, who worked through the prophets.
Okay, so let's start pulling all these different threads together. We've seen clues in the language, and a mysterious figure, and in these divine dialogues. But there's one more little pattern that we should look at.
The number 3. Now we have to be careful here. We're not getting into weird numerology, but there are some really intriguing threefold patterns that pop up in the Old Testament.
For instance, when the seraphim cry out in Isaiah's vision, they don't just say God is holy, they cry, "Holy, holy, holy."
It's this threefold repetition for ultimate emphasis. Some scholars see this as a subtle nod to the three persons of the Godhead. And it's the same with that famous priestly blessing from Numbers. It calls on the Lord's name 3 distinct times.
So let's recap the case file. What clues did our investigation turn up? First, we found plural language, like the name Elohim and the pronoun us, being used for the one God. Second, we met the angel of the Lord, who is somehow both distinct from and yet identified with God. Third, we saw passages that point to an internal dialogue within the Godhead. And finally, we noticed these subtle, threefold patterns in worship and blessing.
So in the end, while the Old Testament might not give us the fully built, finished doctrine of the Trinity, you could definitely argue it gives us the blueprint. It lays this incredible foundation of a plurality within unity that the New Testament then builds on, giving us that full picture of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And that leaves us with the big question to chew on.